In colonial America, social welfare policy standards were held extremely low. The U.S. federal government did not develop strong social policy powers until the Great Depression in the 1930s, 150 years after the Constitution was written. Why was this? In the 17th century England, church and state were combined under the Catholic Church. People were born into status and rarely moved from it. With the decline of the Roman Empire, monarchs took over people's land and forced them to work on it in exchange for protection and gave them the title of a serf. Those who failed, their obligations were sent to court. Due to this decline of the Roman Empire, a large and diverse group of white settlers came to the New World in the 17th and 18th century. They came for a number of reasons, including running from religious persecution or in hopes of bettering their economic condition due to limited land access in England. As the colonies began to form, the colonists looked up to those who rebelled against the hierarchies and monarchies, such as John Locke and Adam Smith. They brought with them the ideas of Martin Luther's Protestant religion that clashed against Catholicism and the Elizabethan Poor Laws as a way to deal with impoverished people. Society was conceptualized as ranks in the colonies. At the lowest ranks, indentured servants, tenant farmers, and common laborers possessed scant resources and no land. Between 1/2 and 2/3 of white immigrants in the 18th century would be indentured servants before or after arriving in the colonies, and their terms typically lasted 4 to 7 years. Local courts provided protection for some indentured servants in the case of poor treatment, although their legal rights were not as complete as they were in England. After their term, indentured servants often had difficulty finding an economic niche for themselves, and many ended up becoming tenant farmers, working at low wages for landowners. Due to this, many Americans became overextended, could not pay debts, and were imprisoned, even though they had no means of paying debts, due to disability or health problems. A poor person or family could be auctioned to a lower bidder who would take care of them in return for payments from local officials. Just as the English had done, many Americans viewed people who were unemployed as undeserving and only would receive indoor relief. Produce was often plentiful, but grain exports to Europe were sometimes so great that the shortages occurred in American cities. Riots became just as common in America as they did in England. Discontent with the monarchy only grew stronger as they blamed the king for the colony's poor economy. The American Revolution occurred and the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. The Constitution did not mention social welfare policies and appeared to restrict the federal government to specific and relatively limited powers. It was assumed that it was unconstitutional for Congress to enact social policies until well into the 20th century. It was widely assumed that women were inferior to males not only physically but morally and intellectually. Prior to the 17th century in England, virtually no woman was literate. They were second-class members of society. Women could own property and sign contracts when they were unmarried or widowed, but they did not usually retain property or sign contracts when married. Children were the legal property of husbands after marriages had been officially dissolved, even when the husband had been unfaithful or abusive. Women also faced hardship because there was no adequate form of birth control. Women who could not fend for themselves were increasingly forced into newly constructed poorhouses. In colonial America, natives were faced with even harsher treatment. Indigenous people were allowed to keep their property. They were forced to give most of their produce to the conquerors in return for protection. They had no natural resistance to European diseases like smallpox or measles or influenza, and millions died. Early settlements in Massachusetts established praying colonies where converted Native Americans lived as a part of the community but were stripped of their culture and identity. Native Americans were a potential source of labor, but they were not willing to work and were not easily enslaved. White indentured servants became the major source of agricultural labor, but proved themselves unsuitable because many of them refused to work in the summer heat and had to be replaced at the end of their contract. Slaves, on the other hand, could be violently disciplined without the surveillance of local courts. Slaves were not allowed to own property, and if they did, it was confiscated and redistributed to poor whites. Whites were forbidden by law to have sexual relations with Africans, and people who were sheltered or assisted runaway slaves were subjected to harsh treatment. Social welfare institutions did not extend assistance to African Americans. There was a policy that prevented slave owners from freeing their slaves when they could no longer work or were sick. The treatment of POC was justified through the idea of promoting Christianity with Native American tribes and teaching slaves discipline and good work habits. Social welfare policy in the colonial period centered on the local poor law institutions, which included a mixture of indoor or institutional relief and outdoor relief. Local courts assumed relatively minor social welfare functions with respect to orphans, divorce petitions, and prosecutions of people who were raped. While they were trying to create a new world by shattering the glass floor of monarchies, the colonists created a new hierarchy, while still implementing the things they hated most, but just targeting a different group of people. They still only accepted one religion, Christianity. They created a class system, continued to reject women, but now they'd implemented a large-scale slavery, stripping people of their culture, rights, and humanity.